Thanks a lot, and good afternoon, everyone. I also want to say my thanks to the organizers and actually all participants, because I thought this is a very extremely inspiring conference, and I really enjoyed the way we talked and about informality and illegality. What I'm going to do in this presentation is to talk about tiny houses in the United States. That's a form of illegal housing that is rapidly evolving, and it's actually much talked about as a solution to housing crises. And I want to interrogate this bold and ambitious promise of tiny houses that are propagated as solution to two big housing problems in the US. For once, they're supposed or considered a solution to ending homelessness, where tiny houses are promoted as a more dignified, cheaper, and faster alternative to emergency shelters and a first step to housing first. And secondly, they're considered a way of resurrecting the American dream of home ownership, where the tiny house is promoted as an innovative, affordable housing alternative for the ailing middle classes that struggle to find an entry into the propertied housing market. These two problems highlight the exclusions of propertied citizenship, which I will talk about in this presentation. And I will discuss how the tiny house can challenge this. Just a couple of words on how this project or this paper developed. It's based on material from my dissertation research on homeless encampments, and it was great actually to see the previous presentation because it's sort of like shocking to see how these phenomena are around. And tiny houses emerged in this research as a theme because, as I show here on this picture, the residents just like simply started building tiny houses as a sort of logical evolution for them to improve their living conditions. But I have yet not written about that, so I'm happy for this opportunity. And what I'm doing here is I'm relating my research that ended in 2015 to the current development of the tiny house movement, but also in particular tiny house villages in the US. And that's all work in progress, and I apologize that this is more exploratory than actually finalized. And I also want to add a conceptual perspective to our discussion, highlighting the role of hegemonic struggle, illegalization or legalization as a hegemonic struggle, and the role of poverty governance or the welfare state in order to understand illegality in the global north. Presentation, okay, good. Just the context, and I will not go into the detail because you probably know all about that. There's a massive housing crisis in the US, and that prompts a lot of coping strategies. And there's several studies, and they have been mentioned in this conference before, that started to analyze this range of shadow housing that is home to actually thousands of Americans. And this illegal housing includes various forms of more visible and invisible makeshift and self-help housing, to which belong also the tiny house, which does not comply to most zoning and building regulations. All of this, however, is not new or surprising. It simply confirms, as Larson predicted already in 2002, that informal housing has moved from the borderlands to the heartland. But since the 2008 financial crisis, what we also see is a multiplication of claims that demand legal recognition for illegal or outlaw housing as inexpensive housing alternatives. Such a critique on housing regulations as barrier to more affordable housing, however, is not new either. But the current debate, I argue, is interesting, particularly in contrast to the debates of the 1980s, because it does not focus only on the poor. Especially this claim to legalize tiny houses suggests a shared housing solution for different social classes. And this blueprint here on the left illustrates how the tiny house is framed as a solution that can address the housing problems of both the homeless and the not happily housed, to put it bluntly. There are, of course, differences in what housing insecurity means, where for some the alternative to the tiny house is the street or a homeless shelter, while for others it is expensive apartments, living with parents, or a flat share. But I argue the persuasive power of the tiny house claim is explained by exactly this class-crossing promise that brings together housing insecurity of the aging boomers, the millennials, and the homeless poor. And these claims seem to have had some effect. 10 years ago, when I started my research on homeless encampments in the US, such claims were actually belittled. They seemed exotic, and were most of the time rejected and marginalized. But today, there are 115 tiny house villages for the homeless across the US, where there before was only literally Dignity Village in Portland, Oregon. And there are about 10,000 tiny houses, according to an estimate by the Financial Times. While research apparently only has begun to assess this surprising shift in the landscape of illegal housing, and I really am like this research by Susan Evans, there are still many open questions. What are actually the drivers and what are the functions of these tiny houses? Given the lack of the data, it's really hard to assess or give answers to these questions. And therefore, my focus in this paper is to focus on the process of the driving forces. And I will analyze the process of legalizing tiny houses to examine how the state responds to claims for tiny houses. And to do that, a short theoretical coda. I analyze which conditions the legalization of tiny houses enables by using two intersecting concepts by Ananya Roy and Peter Marcuse. Following the paradigm of propertied citizenship, poverty governance in the global north limits the politics of informality for the non-propertied. Tiny houses are therefore to be tolerated on property and can claim legality, but the homeless are not likely to be successful in claiming a pathway from no housing to tent to tiny house. And this is elaborated by Neutralizing Homelessness, which argues that the system of homeless management does not only govern the homeless with some care and actually more coercion, its political function is to neutralize structural homelessness that cannot be ended in capitalism. Governments seek therefore ways to neutralize this scandal of the necessary dark side of propertied citizenship by maintaining a divide, an artificial or governing divide, between properly, and that includes also the informally housed subjects, and their other, which is the pathological homeless who somehow seem to fail to access property. And following this perspective, governments will prevent, or at least condition tiny houses for the homeless in order to justify why the non-propertied are actually allowed to enter the exclusiveness of propertied citizenship. As a consequence from these two concepts, I do recognize with authors like Smart and Aguilera and others that selective toleration of illegal housing can be useful for the state. But based on what I just talked about I argue that the logics of poverty governance have an impact on the politics of informality, and they do create specific outcomes, which we have to look at least in situations like the one I'm talking about, where the state actively and publicly intervenes to legalize housing for the non-propertied. And to illustrate this, I turn now to 3 case studies where tents evolved into tiny houses. The case of Seattle, Olympia, and Fresno show that the idea of the tiny house village as a solution to local problems is realized unevenly. Seattle has seen a massive replication. After the city changed regulations in 2015, the number of tiny house villages grew to today 9 tiny house villages with a total of 400 tiny houses about, which is the biggest concentration within the US. Olympia, which is the small capital of Washington State, established the first tiny house village in 2014, and 2 more were built recently. In Fresno, however, which has the oldest tiny house village since 2004, this was not replicated. This city is actually also not mentioned in the larger tiny house debate, which is probably due to the fact that those tool sheds do not really look like any kind of attractive solution. These differences highlight the local path dependencies, which require an analysis of both process and outcome. My approach to that is a critical policy analysis of legalization as hegemonic struggle, with which I highlight both the negotiability of policies and laws and the role of consent. Following Newman, I differentiate 2 steps that are required for a policy change to legalize an illegal and stigmatized land use. First, a struggle that articulates a local crisis as a problem that destabilizes the existing system by formulating a desirable solution. And second, a negotiation to render this new solution compatible to hegemonic power relations. And my analysis showed that the crisis of affordable housing as such is not sufficient for policy change that touches on the logics of propertied space. I can't go into the details here, But in each of the cases, the legalization was preceded by a double crisis of sheltering and a crisis of criminalization, which both together failed to contain the homeless. Articulating these crises involved a long struggle of activists and advocates with protest and direct action, legal battles where courts play a decisive role, and sustained support from civil society that multiplies these messages of crisis. It's only on the basis of this crisis and this failure that governments accepted the legalization of tiny houses as a solution and then took it on, like the Fresno mayor who promised to put right his failure to help the city's poorest when he opened this tiny house village. The existence of tiny house villages in propertied space is highly conditional, and the negotiation of these conditions is mediated by various actors from civil society. These are all complex stories where the previously legalized camps, like in Olympia and in Seattle, serve as a regulatory icebreaker and model for the tiny house villages. And from my comparison, I highlight here 4 key steps of the process to access property and for the conditions of its use. The first is property hosts. Every village is located on property by public or private institutions that have a non-profit orientation. These are typically homeless service providers, and in Seattle, these are often churches or faith-based organizations. Local government holds these property hosts accountable to control the conditions of the villages. Property hosts have to ensure internal control and community relations. That is, they organize the acceptance from the neighborhood, but they also have to cover costs for establishing and running the village through charities, donations, self-help, and some city funding. The second is legalization. The villages in Fresno and Olympia are legalized as a special land use like campground or special housing, or with temporary use permits. In Seattle, the latter kind of legalization shifted from exception to special rule. The first local ordinance that allowed churches to host an encampment for 6 months was amended over the years to allow now for longer permits of 1, 2, and even more years. And temporary here means apparently foremost that the structures can be removed and are not permanent. Similarly, the initial exclusive right for churches to host such camps, which they won in court as an expression of their freedom for religious exercise, was also expanded in the subsequent years as a right for other property owners. And since 2015, it's also public land that is used to locate those villages. Thirdly, a code of conduct. Legality depends on a specific code of conduct that is mandatory for the property host to get the use permit. These requirements include distances to school, visual barriers, and security, and reflect the control interests of neighbors. But the code of conduct is not only top-down imposed. It is also a result of negotiations to enable self-governance, which the homeless communities aim at to address external stereotypes and also to ensure internal order through self-imposed rules for living together. And fourthly, lastly, ending homelessness. Every village has to demonstrate, and that's part of the code of the conduct, its performance as adequate homeless service to get legalized and to get public funding. This means beyond providing shelter, which curiously enough is a minor concern for the legalization and simple building standards are enough, there have to be measurable efforts in transitioning residents out of homelessness. This means service and counseling, as well as data management of access and time of stay. How generalizable are now these 3 cases? Following the 3 models of legalized encampments that I identified in my dissertation, I conclude that the authoritarian camp, which allows no self-governance, remains an exception. And accordingly, I have not found an authoritarian-run tiny house village. What we do see is an increase of the nonprofit model. My comparison shows a trend towards professionalization that integrates more or less elements of self-governing, but also displaces the self-governing model as such. In Seattle, in the year 2019, the homeless self-help organization Legalising, which paved the way for the tiny house villages, was pushed out from managing because they did not adhere to the city's requirements on service performance, which is a central point of contestation. Legalising, the organization, insisted on self-governance, autonomy, and commoning. They wanted simply to provide shelter for everyone in need and who is willing to contribute to the community. Mandatory screening processes and services are rejected because they are considered what Lutz calls the medicalization of homelessness. Now, most of the villages in Seattle are run by the Low Income Housing Institute, a large housing and service provider, which replaced the self-elected elders with managers that oversee access and operations. It is relevant to see that this professionalization of managing institutions is actively prescribed by the new regulations. The tenders of local governments illustrate detailed qualifications that are required from operators. And accordingly, most villages function today as special transitional homeless services with a time limit. The data of Evans shows that only 25% of all tiny house villages offer permanent living, whereas the large majority reproduce the categorizations of homelessness and cater exclusively for the so-called chronically homeless. Yet, these restrictive conditions also make the villages more acceptable. They mobilize public money and donations. It's just this January that private businesses in Seattle pledged to invest $1 million to double the number of tiny house villages in Seattle. In this process, we can also see that an improvement of the buildings, which planners, however, still not consider housing. To sum it up, legalization is conditional. Yet we need to remind that legalization itself is not sufficient for establishing a tiny house village either. For instance, in the state of Washington, there are laws that allow a tiny house village for the homeless in all cities, but this was not realized in many cities beyond Seattle. Instead, as this quote I show here on the right underlines, the legalization of camps or a village requires specific components and compromises. My interview partner here stresses the temporality of use and the fact that governments want to reduce political and fiscal costs by devolving responsibility to private organizations and charities. But as I said before, involved is also a history of struggle, the legal recognition as a catalyst for the negotiation, and community self-organizing as motor for a viable tiny house village. There are various examples of unrealized tiny house proposals which highlight that this kind of a fuller mix of compromises and conditions is needed. Elaborate blueprints as such are simply not persuasive enough. And returning to the case of Fresno, this remains exceptional simply because there, the nonprofit operator decided not to expand this kind of service. I didn't check the time. I have one more page. Is that still fine?
Yeah, you've got 2 minutes left.
Cool. I'm going to do that. To conclude, I want to expand the discussion with some reflections on how this legalization of tiny house villages for the homeless relates to the wider tiny house movement. The legalizations prescribe two pathways of informal housing politics, which reproduce the divide of propertied citizenship. The non-propertied claim property is subject to the logics of poverty governance, but it also can challenge propertied citizenship by reinventing small affordable housing and by engaging in housing commoning. And the second pathway, the claim of the aspiring tiny property owners, extends and stabilizes propertied citizenship. But as I will show, the conditions of legalization do actually not fully match these aspirations. Wherefore, I think the tiny house so far remains nothing more than a powerful fantasy. To highlight the limited conditions of propertied citizenship, I color-coded here differences and actually also some interesting similarities of these two pathways. Similarities are evident in regards to coping with illegality. Visibility is precarious, even though we do not really know how many tiny houses are actually evicted. But we do know much about homeless encampments that are swept away. And both depend on toleration by property owners to persist more securely in illegality. The difference in struggle has effect on the outcome of legalization. Where the collective struggle of the homeless involves organizing and allies and results in active negotiation of specific legalizations, the tiny house movement is mostly about individual struggles with local authorities. Such a quiet encroachment of the ordinary may achieve toleration, but I argue such a lifestyle practice struggles to build political pressure for policy change. It's actually only few cities that legalized so far lots and land for tiny houses on wheels or without. And these cities tend to be holiday resorts or shrinking cities like Fresno. The main regulatory response to the tiny house so far are the attached dwelling unit laws, which we talked about or heard about before from Australia, which nudge existing homeowners to maximize the use of their property. But these laws do not really promote the aspired single tiny house ownership. Thus, emphasizing renting, the ADU laws bring the tiny houses back to the dependency on property hosts. NIMBY resistance is also strong for all tiny houses. In Seattle, the homeowner associations who fear for loss of property value have halted the new law for attached dwelling units for almost 10 years. And after this law was finally passed, concerns still remain whether these actually increase affordable housing or rather increase speculative uses such as short-term rentals. Therefore, the scope of negotiability for the tiny houses remains limited. They can only increase it by moving outside the cities where land is cheaper and where the remaining trailer parks offer another legal option. In contrast, the homeless tiny houses do have a potential for commoning in cities. Well, that's the end of my presentation. And as an outlook, I plan to improve this systematic into a typology that maps how the tiny house reinvents various forms of historical substandard housing, such as the trailer park, the single room occupancy hotel, or the backyard cottage, and also opens new possibilities for commoning. Thank you.